The Civil War, 1865. The decades of growing disagreements over slavery, states' rights, and economic differences finally exploded into a full-scale armed conflict. Chapter 8 of our U.S. history journey covers the American Civil War, the deadliest war in U.S. history, a conflict that pitted Americans against Americans and ultimately redefined the nation. 1. The nation divides. Causes of the Civil War. The Civil War was not caused by a single event, but by a culmination of tensions, with slavery at its absolute core. Slavery as the fundamental cause. While other factors like economic differences, industrial North versus agricultural South, and states' rights, who has more power, federal government or states, played roles. These were almost always tied back to the issue of slavery. The South's economy and way of life were deeply dependent on enslaved labor, while the North largely abolished slavery and developed a free labor industrial economy. Failed compromises. Over decades, Congress tried to keep the peace with various compromises, like the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850, regarding the expansion of slavery into new territories. However, these only delayed, rather than resolved, the fundamental conflict. Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. Bleeding Kansas. This act introduced popular sovereignty, allowing settlers in new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This led to a rush of pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers into Kansas, resulting in widespread violence, chaos, and even killings, earning the territory the nickname Bleeding Kansas. Dred Scott v. Sandford, 1857. The Supreme Court, in a controversial ruling, declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens and had no rights that white Americans were bound to respect. It also ruled that Congress had no power to ban slavery in federal territories, effectively making the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. This decision infuriated abolitionists and deepened the sectional divide. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, 1859. Radical abolitionist John Brown led a raid on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to arm enslaved people and start a rebellion. The raid failed, and Brown was captured and executed. While hailed as a martyr by some Northerners, he was seen as a dangerous terrorist by Southerners, further increasing fears and distrust. The election of 1860, the Republican Party, explicitly anti-slavery expansion, nominated Abraham Lincoln. His victory, achieved without any electoral votes from the Southern states, convinced many Southerners that their voice and their institution of slavery were no longer safe within the Union. Secession. Beginning with South Carolina in December 1860, 11 Southern states declared their secession, formal withdrawal, from the United States. Confederate States of America. These seceded states formed their own nation, the Confederate States of America, often called the Confederacy, or the CSA. With Jefferson Davis as their president, they drafted a constitution similar to the U.S. Constitution but explicitly protected slavery. 2. The war begins. First shots and early strategies. Attack on Fort Sumter, April 1861. The war officially began when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter, a Union-held fort in Charleston, South Carolina. This act of aggression prompted President Lincoln to call for volunteers to put down the rebellion, leading 4 more Southern states to secede and join the Confederacy. Strengths and weaknesses. Union versus Confederacy. Union. North. Strengths. Much larger population. 22 million versus 9 million in South, including 5 million enslaved people, more factories, producing weapons and supplies, more miles of railroad for troop and supply movement, an established government and army, and a strong navy. Weaknesses: had to invade and conquer a large, unfamiliar territory. Less motivated defenders initially. Weaker military leadership initially. Confederacy. South. Strengths: fighting a defensive war on their home soil. Knew the land better. Strong military leadership, especially Robert E. Lee. Highly motivated defenders protecting their way of life. Skilled horsemen and marksmen. Weaknesses: smaller population, fewer factories, fewer railroads, weaker government, reliance on imports, blockade vulnerability. Goals and strategies: Union strategy, Anaconda Plan, devised by General Winfield Scott. It involved naval blockade, blockading southern ports to cut off trade and supplies. Control the Mississippi River, gaining control of the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy in half. Capture Richmond, capturing Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. Confederate strategy: defensive war, defend their territory and inflict heavy casualties on the Union. Wear down the Union, wear down the North's will to fight. Gain foreign recognition. Hope to gain military and financial support from European powers, especially Great Britain and France, who relied on Southern cotton. Key figures: early war. Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States. Union. His primary goal was to preserve the Union. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America. Ulysses S. Grant, Union. A rising Union general who would eventually lead all Union armies. Robert E. Lee, Confederate. Brilliant Confederate general, offered command of Union Army but chose to fight for Virginia. Thomas Stonewall Jackson, Confederate. Another highly effective Confederate general. 3. Major battles and turning points. The Civil War was a long, brutal, and bloody conflict. Several key battles proved to be turning points that shifted the momentum. First Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, July 1861. The first major land battle of the war, fought near Washington, D.C. It showed both sides that the war would not be quick or easy, resulting in a surprising Confederate victory. Battle of Antietam, September 1862. The bloodiest single-day battle in U.S. history. Fought in Maryland, it was a Union strategic victory as it forced Lee to retreat from Northern territory. This victory gave President Lincoln the crucial confidence he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation Proclamation, January 1863. A presidential proclamation issued by Lincoln. It declared that all enslaved people in the Confederate States were free. This did not immediately free anyone still enslaved in those territories, but it shifted the war's purpose. It was now not just about preserving the Union, but also about ending slavery. It also discouraged Great Britain and France from supporting the Confederacy, as those nations had already abolished slavery. Battle of Gettysburg, July 1863. Fought in Pennsylvania, this was a major turning point in the East. A decisive Union victory that stopped Lee's second and final invasion of the North. The three-day battle resulted in massive casualties for both sides. Siege of Vicksburg, July 1863. Simultaneously with Gettysburg, Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant finally captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, after a long siege. This victory gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in half and severely disrupting their supply lines. 4. Life during the war. The Civil War profoundly affected everyone, not just the soldiers. Soldier life. Life for soldiers on both sides was incredibly difficult. They faced harsh conditions, primitive medical care, disease, which killed more soldiers than combat, boredom, and terrifying combat. New technologies like more accurate rifles and ironclad ships made the fighting even deadlier. Home fronts, North. Industry boomed as factories produced war materials. Women took on new roles in factories, nursing, and managing farms. South. faced severe shortages of food, supplies, and manpower due to the Union blockade and the focus on fighting. Women managed plantations and farms, often under immense hardship. African Americans in the war. After the Emancipation Proclamation, many formerly enslaved people joined the Union Army, forming United States Colored Troops, USCT regiments. They fought bravely for their freedom and for the Union, though often facing discrimination and harsher treatment if captured by the Confederates. Even before formal enlistment, many enslaved people sabotaged Confederate war efforts or sought refuge behind Union lines. 5. The end of the war. The final years of the war saw relentless Union pressure under the command of Ulysses S. Grant, who understood that total war was necessary to defeat the Confederacy. Sherman's March to the Sea, 1864. Union General William Tecumseh. Sherman led his troops on a devastating total war campaign across Georgia, destroying Confederate infrastructure, farms, and morale. This brought the harsh reality of war to the Southern civilian population. Grant's Overland Campaign, 1865. Grant engaged Lee in a series of brutal, continuous battles in Virginia, accepting heavy casualties but relentlessly pursuing Lee's army, slowly grinding down the Confederate forces. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, April 1865. With his army exhausted and surrounded, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. This effectively ended the major fighting of the Civil War. Lincoln's assassination, April 1865. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, President Abraham Lincoln was tragically assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. His death cast a pall over the Union's victory and left the nation facing the monumental task of reunification without his unifying leadership. 6. Immediate aftermath and consequences. The Civil War was the costliest war in American history. Human cost. Over 620,000 soldiers died, more than all other American wars combined until Vietnam. Millions more were wounded or scarred. Economic devastation. The South's economy was utterly devastated, with its infrastructure destroyed, and its labor system, slavery, abolished. End of slavery. The war definitively ended slavery throughout the United States, later formally enshrined in the 13th Amendment. Preservation of the Union. The Union was preserved, affirming the idea that the United States was one indivisible nation. Beginning of Reconstruction. The end of the war immediately brought about the challenging era of Reconstruction, as the nation grappled with how to rebuild the South and integrate 4 million newly freed African Americans into society. The Civil War was a pivotal moment that reshaped the United States politically, socially, and economically, fundamentally altering its path and forcing it to confront the true meaning of its founding principles.